jobs, and we have seen the most rapid spike in unemployment in history. But some things have been going on during this time that many people might find a little bit shady, to say the very least. This is the very strange unemployment crisis. In early February of this year, everything seemed relatively fine, as the unemployment rate was at a low of about 3.5%, and the biggest economic stories in the world at the time were some cancellations of flights to China and a mild slowdown in the manufacturing sector. But as we all know, things changed fairly quickly. In late February, the stock market began to crater, as it had its worst week since the financial crisis of 2008. And also, China's manufacturing sector completely shut down during that time, and in late March, lockdowns were imposed throughout the entire world. All of these factors caused business closures, bankruptcies, and layoffs at a rate that the world had never seen before. I mean, on March 1st of 2020, the unemployment rate in the United States was still at a healthy 4%. But by late April, that number ballooned to a whopping 14.7%. A number that we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. And that number was expected to get worse. Much worse. In fact, the United States government was preparing for an unemployment rate at above 20% in May, but that is not what happened. You see, unemployment actually dropped to 13.3% in May, which led many to believe that the reopening of some businesses, many of which aren't allowed to operate at full capacity, led to this drop in unemployment numbers. But something seemed a little fishy about those numbers, because many of the top economists and the government of the United States expected that we would reach a 20% unemployment rate at some point during this crisis. Yet it was being reported that we didn't come anywhere close to hitting that mark. But as it turns out, we already did. So the very first thing you should know is that the unemployment spike happened so fast that the Labor Department had trouble keeping up with the influx of new unemployment data. So they ended up misclassifying millions of Americans in relation to their employment status. So the Labor Department ended up classifying millions of people as employed but not working, when they should have been classified as a temporary layoff, and therefore unemployed. In fact, if the Labor Department were to have properly classified these individuals, then the unemployment rate in April would have already hit 19.7%, and in May it would have hit 16.7%. These rates are much closer to the expected 20% number. But we are not done there. You see, what many people don't know about the unemployment numbers is who is actually considered unemployed. You see, the unemployment rate is not a simple equation of the amount of adults that are unemployed within a population. It is actually more complex. And I will explain some of the reasons why the unemployment rate is much higher than you think. For example, did you know that if you are not looking to work and you are unemployed, then you are actually not counted as unemployed in the United States? And this somewhat makes sense, because there are plenty of stay-at-home adults that are able to work, but are doing some time-consuming and important activities like raising children or caring for loved ones. And what we saw in the last 2 months is an increase in the amount of people who are no longer looking to work, and therefore are no longer counted as unemployed. We have also seen a massive reduction in the amount of work hours for individuals, and an increase in the amount of people going from full-time work to part-time work. So if you were to include those factors into the reported unemployment rate, then the rate would be much closer to 22%. Now, if you wanted to go one step further, we could talk about the real employment rate. You see, what many people may not think about is that the majority of people in any country actually do not work. That is because when you include kids, elderly people, disabled people, and unemployed individuals, then currently in the United States, there are only about 135 million people working out of a population of 330 million people. Meaning that as of right now, only 40.9% of the population is actually employed and currently working. Now, over the last several decades, we've also been going through a shift in the type of employment that most individuals have. You see, the Labor Department says that anyone who has done work for pay or profit during the survey week is considered employed. That means if you went to your uncle's house for a few hours to help him put up a fence, and you got paid, let's say $50, and that was all the money that you made that week, then you are technically considered employed by the Labor Department. Now, even though that is a rare example, it is a sign that the Labor Department considers people who work substantially less than full-time as employed. And this part of the employment sector has been the fastest growing sector over the last several decades. For example, Canada in 1976 had 12.6% of its employment come from part-time individuals. Now that number today is roughly 19.2%. And other precarious types of employment like temp work and contract work have increased by 30% and 83% respectively since 1997. All this means is that even though you might be considered employed in your country for legal purposes, that does not mean that you are in a stable job or making enough money to survive. It also means that the classic full-time job with a salary and benefits has slowly been decreasing over the last 5 decades, while there has been an increase in the amount of underemployment during that time. And this shift has been exacerbated during the lockdowns. So do you remember when I said earlier how it was reported that the unemployment rate in the United States was recovering, as the reported rate dropped from 14.7% to 13.3%? Well, as it turns out, 40% of those new jobs are solely part-time jobs or less. I mean, let's take a look at the numbers. 18 million full-time jobs and 8 million part-time jobs in the United States were lost during March and April. And the recent recovery data showed that 2.2 million full-time jobs and 1.6 million part-time jobs were gained in May. All this means is that part-time jobs came back at a much faster rate and are responsible for a lot of the supposed economic recovery in May. The recovery was not from full-time employment, despite most of the jobs lost being from full-time employment. And when you interpret this data, all it means is that the economic data that we have been given recently is a lot bleaker than it seems. There are still tens of millions of people without jobs, and those that did get jobs are most likely in a worse position than they were 2 months ago. And even though this video has been painting a pretty bad picture, here's what I will say and have been saying for the past several months. So because we went through the sharpest decline of an economy in history, and it is largely due to the lockdowns and restrictions, we could theoretically see the fastest economic recovery in history as restrictions begin to loosen up. I mean, who knows, maybe we will be looking back on this video in a few months, and the unemployment rate might be back to single digits, and maybe a lot of the new jobs created will be full-time. But regardless, this economic decline has caused a ton of long-term repercussions, such as a currency crisis and a debt crisis, which will likely be felt for years to come. And if you're interested in hearing about those topics, I have made videos on those, which you can check out in my documentaries playlist. And if you liked this video, please leave a like and subscribe, that would mean the world to me. And I'm trying to release a couple videos like this every week, so stay tuned for the next one. Anyways, make sure to click on my next video or playlist, and I will see you guys there in just a few seconds.